Introducing my brand new course, Catalyst Academy. Grow a thriving YouTube channel in as little as 5 hours per week. The course is dropping June 1st, but you can take advantage of the 50% off pre-launch sale this week only. This is the lowest the course will ever be offered for, so if you've ever thought about creating your own YouTube channel, take advantage of the price now. And I'm doing a giveaway! Get your hands on my free YouTube Get Started guide at the link below, and you'll automatically be entered to win the course for free. That giveaway ends this Thursday, May 4th at midnight, so enter now before it's too late. On the evening of April 13th, a 16-year-old black boy named 𝗪𝗠𝗪𝗓 approached a house in a residential neighborhood of Kansas City. He had driven there to pick up his younger brothers, twins, who had been spending time at a friend's house. According to Ralph, he rang the doorbell and waited. An 84-year-old white man opened the door and shot him in the head, and then again in the arm, as Ralph fled the scene. He had gotten the address wrong. A few days later, and hundreds of miles away on the night of April 15th in rural upstate New York, a car full of friends pulled into a driveway thinking it belonged to a friend they were attempting to visit. When they realized they were at the wrong address, they turned around and began driving away from the house. A man came out, pointed a gun at the car, and opened fire. A woman riding in the car was shot, and by the time her friends were able to get cell service and call the police, she was dead. Around midnight on April 18th, in a grocery store parking lot, a group of elite cheerleaders had just finished a grueling day of competition and were meeting in the parking lot to drive home. One girl opened a car door thinking it was her vehicle, only to find a man sitting in the car. When she realized her mistake, she immediately retreated to her friend's vehicle. The man, who had been sitting there in the car, left the vehicle, approached the cheerleaders, and opened fire, injuring 2 of them before they were able to flee. The shooters in the first 2 incidents have pled not guilty, and this has reignited a frequent debate around gun laws in America related to stand your ground laws and the entrenched idea of self-defense via the use of guns as inherently protected by the Second Amendment of our Constitution. Despite the fervor with which gun rights activists proclaim that their right to self-defense is ordained by the Second Amendment, that interpretation is relatively new. And despite the fact that America has the highest rate of gun deaths per capita of any similarly situated country, highest by a mile, including both individual homicides and suicides, as well as mass shootings, as a country we are bitterly divided over gun control or doing anything at all to curb this violence. So I wanted to take some time and try to answer the age-old question. Why are Americans so obsessed with guns? Roll the intro. Thank you to Factor for partnering with me on today's video. Have you ever thought to yourself, wow, I really don't want to cook dinner tonight. I'm exhausted. I deserve a little treat, but I also don't want to spend a truckload on takeout. What's a girl to do? Factor. That's what. With Factor's ready-made, fresh, never frozen meals, you can skip the grocery store, the prep, and the cleanup too. Their meals are ready in just 2 minutes, and they are literally, and I cannot stress this enough, so delicious. You already know if you follow me a lot that I've been hitting the gym lately, all right? I've been working on adding some muscles, getting swole, etc. But going to the gym takes energy, and building muscle requires some protein. I love to refuel with Factor, and they have tons of meal plans to choose from, including Protein Plus meals with 30 grams of protein or more per meal. They have over 34 plus chef-prepared, dietitian-approved weekly options, so there's always something new to try. Plus, they offer snacks, and you know I love snacks, including really delicious fruit smoothies. I recently tried their Indian butter chicken with cilantro and lime cauliflower rice, and boy howdy, it was tasty. So head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code Leeja40 to get 40% off your first Factor box. Thanks, Factor. So both of the shooters pled not guilty, and they will likely claim that they were acting in self-defense. In Missouri, the state has a stand your ground law. Stand your ground laws say that if you have a legal right to be in a place, in your home or elsewhere, then you have no duty to retreat, and you can meet force with force, including deadly force, so long as you reasonably believe it is necessary to prevent death or great bodily harm, or to prevent a forcible felony. And that's pretty broad. It applies to your home and elsewhere. It applies to feeling threat not only of death, but also if you're afraid of bodily harm or a forcible felony like arson, kidnapping, or armed robbery. Basically, stand your ground laws are like souped up self-defense laws, and 30 states in the US have them. The key question is whether the person reasonably believed that there was a threat. And what's reasonable is pretty wishy-washy, especially when race is involved and a jury of your peers thinks that it was reasonable reasonable to fear a black kid in a hoodie. The question of who gets to stand their ground is an entirely different discussion. In New York, where the second shooting occurred, there is no stand your ground law, but the common law, or that judge-made law, does incorporate the castle doctrine, based on the idea that your home is your castle. So if you shoot an intruder, it's presumed self-defense. However, again, the key here is whether the shooter reasonably believed that the person entering their property was there to commit a crime. And what's reasonable is, again, wishy-washy, though the castle doctrine is far less broad than the stand your ground laws. It is still rooted, though, in this belief that using force, including guns for self-defense, on your property is valid. And there are many in this country who believe that beyond the stand your ground laws and the castle doctrine, the Second Amendment guarantees this right, the right to own guns for the purpose of individual self-defense. And that idea has gained a strong foothold in mainstream American sentiment, but that hasn't always been true. So let's take a step back into history, shall we, to dissect the Second Amendment and how we got from that to wherever the hell it is that we are today. The Second Amendment says, as a reminder, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Which is an inherently confusing sentence, and thus we have been arguing about it for 2.5 centuries. But the writers didn't just come up with that out of thin air. They wrote those words in the historical context of the late 1700s and based on the ideas of political theorists who they relied upon to help them build what they believed to be an ideal republic. Also, despite recently winning a revolutionary war against them, they did rely deeply on English law to write the laws of this country. And in English law, the origins of the Second Amendment can be traced back to the late 16th century, when Queen Elizabeth I instituted a national militia in which individuals of all classes were required by law to take part to defend the realm. Some constitutional law scholars believe that the language of the right to keep and bear arms was included as a means to accomplish the objective of a well-regulated militia. Yes, in order to check federal tyranny, but also to bring constitutional balance by distributing the power of the weapons equally among the people, the states, and the federal government. Equally is, of course, in quotations because we all know that women and slaves were not included in this equation. And in the American colonies, there was a universal draft to local militias whereby men of all classes were required to maintain guns for the safety and defense of the state. And they didn't come up with that idea themselves either. The framers of the Constitution were highly influenced by various political theorists, for example, 𝗓𝗏𝗧𝗏 Machiavelli, and his writings, including The Prince and The Art of War. In The Art of War, Machiavelli posits that soldiering should be the responsibility of every citizen, but the profession of none. He said military service should merge with the rights and responsibilities of citizenship, and said that there should never be any soldier who made war his only occupation. In Lawrence Delbert Kress's article, An Armed Community, The Origins and Meaning of the Right to Bear Arms, Kress summarizes Machiavelli's position, saying citizens bore arms in defense of the state, motivated by a commitment to the common good and officered by the nation's most respected individuals. Machiavelli wrote that tyranny only happens when citizens allowed professional soldiers, unmoved by a sense of the common good, to subvert the military power of the state to their own self-interest. Hence, Machiavelli concluded, a good man would not make war his only profession. It is in this context that the framers wrote the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This amendment was also meant to protect against domestic insurrection. This is not just in theory. 4 years prior to the signing of the Bill of Rights, Shays' Rebellion, a citizen-led armed insurgency in Massachusetts, roiled the nation. The rebellion was squashed by the federal government, and the episode led many to push for a stronger central government at the Constitutional Convention in order to protect against such insurrections. Thus, concludes Kress, the Second Amendment assured the people, through the agency of a well-regulated militia, a role in the preservation of both the external and internal security of the Republic. It did not guarantee the right of individuals like Daniel Shays and his followers to closet armaments. Guns, according to Kress, were understood by Republican political theorists at the time our Constitution was written to have a place in society only in service of the common good, and that access to arms was understood to be a communal rather than an individual right. In the years since the founding, the idea of citizenship being connected to militia service and commitment to the greater public good has been corroded and bastardized by American individualism, which has interpreted the Second Amendment to mean that people have the right to bear arms primarily for self-defense. And that idea has been legitimized by the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Second Amendment over the last 2 decades. And you can see this seismic shift in our individualism and how interpretation of the Second Amendment has changed through the Supreme Court cases about the Second Amendment. Prior to 2008, the Supreme Court hadn't heard a case about the Second Amendment since 1939. In that 1939 case, U.S. v. Miller, an Arkansas Federal District Court charged Jack Miller and Frank Layton with violating the National Firearms Act of 1934, also known as the NFA, when they transported a sawed-off double-barrel 12-gauge shotgun in interstate commerce. The NFA, passed in 1934, was the first federal gun control law in the United States. The two appealed, saying that the law violates their Second Amendment right to bear arms. The Supreme Court held that the Second Amendment does not guarantee an individual the right to keep and bear a sawed-off double-barrel shotgun. Writing for the unanimous court, Justice James Clark McReynolds reasoned that because possessing a sawed-off double-barrel shotgun does not have a reasonable relationship to the preservation or efficiency of a well-regulated militia, the Second Amendment does not protect the possession of such an instrument. And then for nearly 70 years, we had major shifts in US culture, not least of which being the growth of the NRA's influence in DC. But at the time of the passage of the National Firearms Act of 1934, the NRA was actually in favor of some regulation. In fact, the president of the NRA in 1934, Carl Frederick, testified before Congress saying, and I quote, "I have never believed in the general practice of carrying weapons. I seldom carry one. I do not believe in the general promiscuous toting of guns. I think it should be sharply restricted and only under licenses." The NRA backed further federal legislation, including the Federal Firearms Act of 1938 and the Gun Control Act of 1968, though they did oppose a national firearms registry. However, after the passage of the Gun Control Act of 1968, a growing faction of NRA gun rights activists began to shift the focus of the group onto politics, where before it had remained largely nonpartisan. The NRA founded its lobbying arm, the Institution for Legislative Action, in 1975 and created its own political action committee in time for the 1976 elections. The wing was helmed by Harlan Carter, who, along with his supporters, were against national gun regulation and believed that no compromise should be made on gun rights. Sound familiar? And in the years since 1975, the NRA has systematically lobbied to break down federal gun control laws and stop any new ones in their tracks. And then by the time the Supreme Court heard its next Second Amendment case in 2008, the societal conversation around guns had completely shifted. In District of Columbia v. Heller in 2008, Scalia, writing the opinion in a hotly divided 5-4 decision, recognized an individual right to possess firearms independently of service in a state militia and to use firearms for self-defense within the home. The court held that the first clause of the Second Amendment, that references a militia, is a prefatory clause that does not limit the operative clause of the amendment. So they said the operative clause of the amendment is the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And the words a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state was, I guess, just throwaway language. Because the text of the amendment should be read in the manner that gives greatest effect to the plain meaning it would have had at the time it was written, the court said that the operative clause should be read to guarantee an individual right to possess and carry weapons in case of confrontation. Scalia then cherry-picks some political writing that backs up his opinion, just like I've cherry-picked academic writing that backs up my opinion with Machiavelli. Do you see how messy this gets? You can find anything from history that will back up what you want to be true, which is exactly what the court did in this case. Justices Stevens, Souter, Ginsburg, and Breyer dissented, saying that the Second Amendment does not create an unlimited right to possess guns for self-defense purposes. Instead, the most natural reading of the amendment is that it protects the right to keep and bear arms for certain military purposes, but does not curtail the legislature's power to regulate non-military use and ownership of weapons. Justice Stevens argued that the amendment states its purpose specifically in relation to state militias and does not address the right to use firearms in self-defense, which is particularly striking that it left out the self-defense part because other similar provisions in state laws and constitutions at the time did specify use of guns for self-defense. So the fact that the framers of the Second Amendment did not mention self-defense self-defense is telling. Justice Breyer also wrote a separate dissent in which he argued that the Second Amendment protects militia-related, not self-defense-related interests, and it does not provide absolute protection from government intervention into those interests, pointing to historical evidence from the time of ratification, which indicates that colonial laws regulated the storage and use of firearms in the home. So regulations of guns in the home was normal at the time of the writing of the Second Amendment, because again, you can cherry pick pretty much anything from history to back up your claims, which is why there is no end in sight to the gun debate in the United States. A subsequent Supreme Court decision called McDonald v. City of Chicago from 2010 held that the Second Amendment's guarantee of the individual right to possess firearms applies to state and local governments as well as to the federal government, because the right to self-defense is fundamental to the nation's scheme of ordered liberty and deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition, which, no, it's not. This was, again, a divided 5-4 decision, with Stevens, Ginsburg, Breyer, and Sotomayor dissenting. And then SCOTUS doubled down on this guns as self-defense narrative, most recently in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin in 2022, ruling that the Second Amendment guarantees an individual right to carry firearms outside the home for the purpose of self-defense, saying that the right to carry a firearm in public for self-defense is deeply rooted in our history, and that the number of gun deaths in this country is irrelevant to the issue. Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan dissented, saying states should be able to pass restrictions in order to curb the number of deaths caused by gun violence. So, as the Second Amendment stands today, based on Supreme Court interpretation, it protects an individual's right to own guns in the home and carry them outside the home for self-defense purposes, despite the fact that there is ample historical evidence that this idea of guns for individual self-defense is not deeply rooted in our history. In fact, the reason why people are so obsessed with guns seems to be an entirely new invention as of the 20th century, and at least based on my research, seems to be due in part to the powerful lobbying of the NRA and gun manufacturers and our government's ability to be easily bought out, plus deeply entrenched US individualism and Christian fundamentalism. During the mid to late 1800s, the US was focused on expanding westward. You've heard the stories: the Wild West, the Gold Rush, the New Frontier, pioneers, immigrants, the Oregon Trail. Our entire lives, we've been spoon-fed this idea of manifest destiny and of the rugged frontiersmen who embody American ideals of rugged individualism and self-reliance, and of building the American dream out of nothing but the mud at the bottom of a riverbed. A lot of that, however, has been fabricated, given the old Hollywood treatment over the course of the 20th century. Westerns became popular, and the more sensationalized the story, the better. So the idea of the gunslinging cowboy has dominated our collective understanding of who we are as a country. But the reality is that many towns in the Wild West really just wanted settlers to move out there, so they wanted their towns to seem safe for people. So many towns required visitors to drop their guns at town hall, and then they could pick them up on their way out of town. The open carrying and slinging of guns in the American West is an invention of Hollywood and conveniently placed NRA propaganda, and we've eaten it up, hook, line, and sinker. But that doesn't fully explain it either. For example, in the 80s and 90s, gun-based massacres in Australia, England, and Canada led those countries to massively crack down on gun ownership. Australia in particular is an interesting comparison. In 1996, Australia suffered a mass shooting rampage that killed 35 people. It was the worst mass shooting in the country's history, and it rocked the country to its core. Within a few months, the country had passed extensive gun reform laws, including a ban on automatic and semi-automatic weapons, a national firearm registration system, and a gun buyback program. Plus, people who wanted to own a gun had to prove a good reason to have one, and self-defense wasn't a good enough reason. This despite the fact that Australia had a powerful gun lobby and a vocal faction of rural voters and leaders who opposed gun reform, and despite the fact that gun laws were largely in the hands of Australian states, typically. And this despite the fact that Australia is also a land of immigrants who braved an even more horrifyingly harsh frontier, relying on rugged individualism and self-reliance to tame the continent. And yet, they managed to get this passed. In the nearly 30 years since this gun reform, Australia has experienced a total of 3 mass shootings, and the rate of gun deaths per 100,000 people went from 2.84 to 0.9. For comparison, in the US, we have experienced 140 mass shootings in the 3.5 months since the start of this year. And our rate of gun deaths per 100,000 people is 13. Again, Australia's is 0.9. So rugged individualism doesn't fully explain it either. Which brings me to Christian fundamentalism. Part of the reason why Australia was able to pass these reforms is because they don't have anything in their constitution like our Second Amendment. And many countries like us do not revere their constitution in the way that we do. I had a French international law professor in law school who loved to criticize how Americans treat our constitution as this sacred cow, as she called it. And that's in part because of the deeply entrenched ethos of Christian fundamentalism rooted in the founding of this country. We revere the founding fathers as ordained with special, almost godlike powers. We are taught about the Constitutional Convention as this coming together of great minds, and the writing of the Constitution this literally superhuman feat of ingenuity. In her book, The Cult of the Constitution, legal scholar and all-around badass Marianne Franks draws a parallel between Second Amendment absolutism and Christian fundamentalism, pointing to the fiery passion that evangelicals, Puritans, and fundamentalists feel towards the Bible and the Word of God, while often cherry-picking the parts of it that back up their beliefs and ignoring the rest. You see similar rhetoric. If you criticize the Second Amendment, then you have desecrated the Constitution itself. And if you critique the Founding Fathers, then you hate America. The Constitution is holy scripture written by Founding Fathers ordained by God. And if you don't blindly support it, then you're met with this hyperbolic, emotionally charged reaction from people who believe in the Constitution based on their faith, as opposed to on the level of logic and reason. I mean, you see that on repeat ad nauseum in my alt-right TikTok reaction series, just people screaming about the Second Amendment as though it is the word of God, and about the Constitution as though it is a holy text. All this from people who are so faithful to the Constitution, but have never actually read it. And certainly haven't read the 250 years of Supreme Court opinions interpreting it either. They're just all up in their feelings about what they think it says and what they think it stands for. That the way it mirrors Christian fundamentalism and frankly cult-like behavior is unnerving, and it explains the willingness to cling to this Second Amendment despite all evidence pointing to the fact that it is tearing apart our country and our democracy. Like, make it make sense, okay? And there are common sense things that we could be doing as a country at a federal level that would likely comply with the Constitution, though probably not under this Supreme Court. Specifically, we could implement a licensing system whereby anyone who wants to buy a gun has to do a background check, get their fingerprints taken, and pass a test. I mean, we make people get a license before they can drive a car. It's absolutely batshit crazy that we don't do that for people who want to buy a literal AR-15 semi-automatic rifle, the most popular gun for mass shooters. This wouldn't solve all of our problems, but it would certainly make it harder to get your hands on a gun, especially reducing impulse gun purchases, because obtaining a license can take weeks. For example, Connecticut implemented a licensing system back in 1995 and saw a reduction in gun homicides and suicides as a result. And this would be supported by American voters everywhere. According to one 2019 poll, 68% of people who live in homes where they have guns are in favor of a gun licensing system. And 77% of US voters generally support a licensing system. This is, as with many issues we talk about here in America, an issue of a very vocal minority controlling the narrative, which is, again, a thing the framers of the Constitution were very wary of: minority rule. And yet, we have a gun lobby spending millions every year to influence and buy out our politicians, the NRA, which has been creating pro-gun propaganda for decades, and far-right platforms like Fox News and its many pundits constantly fear-mongering, telling their people that they want to take our guns away. And that type of fear-mongering and the real fear that happens after mass shootings are really good for business. Gun sales go through the roof after mass shootings. It is very important for the NRA, the gun manufacturers they represent, and the talking heads and politicians that they buy out to keep the American people absolutely terrified, because it sells more guns. And in a world where other major economies like England, Australia, and Canada have all imposed strong gun laws, America is the final frontier for continuing to line their pockets, while the rest of us are out here literally and reasonably afraid for our lives if we make a mistake and accidentally drive up the wrong driveway, open the wrong door, or ring the wrong doorbell. Reminder to grab my free YouTube Get Started guide at the link below by Thursday at midnight and automatically be entered to win my new Catalyst Academy course. If you like this video, you might also like my other video all about why conservatives are so obsessed with parents' rights. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye!